Okay, many alternatives. We'll skip those. Okay, so the drawback of this approach, first, is that it attributes the entire school to the principal. But that's you know, probably not fair. Just in the district that we're going to look at for the data analysis on this, 78% of the teachers were the same when the principal took over as they were the year before. So that would just be an example of one thing that they didn't really influence. They came in, and almost all the teachers weren't really ones that they had chosen. Similarly, 67% of their administrative team in the school was carried over from before. So we may not think that it's fair to attribute it all to the principal. So an alternative approach, still assuming that the effect is immediate and constant, is to compare a principal in a particular school to other principals who have served in that same school. Okay? So this, and the reason you do this is that you, if we think of that school as some kind of constant unit, and we want to see basically if the principal who's there at different times have different effects, if students learn more under one principal than under another. And to do that, we can basically take out the average effect of the school over a long period of time, and then just look at the marginal effects of the principals on top of that. So that's a second approach. And there's a drawback to that, too. So it's actually really quite a big drawback. And that is, one, you have to have a really long panel. You need to be able to observe test scores for a long time, because you have to have principals, multiple principals in a school. Schools actually do change over time, and so, you know, at least for us, we've got a very, in our urban areas, we often have a kind of dynamic student population, and so a school 10 years ago and the school today, that might not be a fair comparison for a principal either. So this idea that the school is fixed is a difficult one. But, you know, so maybe you compare just 1 year to the next. If the principal comes into a school, you can compare him or her to the principal who was there before. The problem with, yeah?
The composition of the students, if there is a change in the composition of the students in 10 years, as you were saying, but you can still capture this in the variables you are taking into account, you are factoring in.
That's right, exactly. So you can control for some of it, but it is possible it changes in ways that you don't really have great controls for. So it has benefits in terms of what you're controlling for. In the first model that we had, you're controlling for student characteristics, but very little about the school. This one, you're controlling for a lot about the school, and you can control for changes in student characteristics over time. But the kind of culture part of the school, or some kind of support from community, things that you don't have measures of, could actually change over a long period of time, too. So that's just saying that it's not perfect. But I actually don't think that's the big drawback. I think the big drawback of this approach, and we'll see it in the data, is that even with a relatively long timeline looking at schools, there are only going to be a couple of principals in the school. 2, 3, 4, something in that range. And so as a principal, you're compared to a very small group of other principals, and that could be kind of idiosyncratic. Do I end up in a school that just happened to have a really good principal before, and then I don't look so good? Or do I end up in one that had a bad one, and then no matter what, I'll look good? And so it's nice in that you've taken the school characteristics that the principals don't control out of the measure, because you're just looking within a school, kind of like when you compare two teachers within a school. But the drawback is you're comparing very few principals to each other. Okay, so that's the second one. And then the third approach is not to think about the principal's effect as constant, but instead to measure how much the school improves over time. So let's say a student learned X amount in 1 year. They learned a certain amount in 1 year. The next year, did they learn more? or did fourth graders learn more the following year, and did fourth graders learn more the year after that? So is the learning of kids going up over time? The first thing we were just talking about is what is the learning of kids. In all cases, we're talking about student gains, but in this case, we're talking about gains in gains. Do the gains get bigger over time? And conceptually, I think this in some ways is the nicest one because you really are talking about school improvement. But empirically, it's very difficult because you need a principal to be in the school a long time in order to see these gains. And the error that you get in looking at gains in gains is really quite big. So the more you look at how much, if you can look at things and as levels, you've got some error, but not nearly as much as error as when you try to look at changes. Because let's say the school looked a little better this year than last year. Is that just, you know, good luck, or is that some really systematic change? And you really need a fairly long timeline to look at systematic change. And often, at least for us, principals don't stay in a school long enough to be able to do that. We have about 25% turnover of principals. So a quarter of principals leave each year, which means that very many of them are not in a school for a very long period of time. Okay, so those are the three approaches. I have this really nice slide here that summarizes them all. But, oh, well, maybe it'll go on to here. I'm just going to pull it all up. So we have three approaches. They're basically school effectiveness, which is what we talked about first, school effectiveness relative to other principals in the school, and then school improvement. And so what I want to do is try to create measures of each of these. Okay. I have the prior literature here, but it's actually summarized on this sheet. And so I think I'm just going to skip the prior literature, except to kind of summarize briefly and say that there's really very little literature on principles value added. I actually only know of 4 papers, only one of which is published. In general, researchers like the principal relative to other principals in the school. That's the measure that they've used. And the focus of those studies have been on how important principals are for student learning. So they've tried basically to get the magnitude of the principal effect by these estimates. But there hasn't been kind of a comparison across different types of estimates and how, there haven't been any attempts to see what's really a valid or good measure. And that's what we're trying to do, at least in theory. So the data that I'm going to use to create these measures comes from the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, which is the 4th largest school district in the United States. And there are about 350,000 students, and we observe them over 8 years. The reason that I'm using a district for this, there are states that you can get data of students linked to principals, but we have all these other measures in Dade County, like the evaluations of the principals, that we can then link to this. The test measure comes from the Florida Comprehensive Assessment Test in math and reading in grades 3 through 10. So in the US, in most states, we test kids in grades 3 through 8, and then again in grade 10, or in one grade in high school. That's the national law, essentially. But in Florida, they also do 9th grade, so it's grade 3 through 10. Okay. So I'm going to estimate each of these approaches based on a kind of simple model. The first model just has controls, so it looks at how much students learn in a particular year, controlling for whether the student qualifies for free or reduced price lunch, which is our measure of poverty, whether they're limited English proficient, so whether they're learning English, whether they've repeated a grade, the number of days they miss school due to absence or suspension in the prior year, race, gender, and then we aggregate those up to the classroom characteristics, the classroom, so that we are controlling for kind of peer effects in the classroom, and then we aggregate them to the school to control for school characteristics. So So we have all of those in there, and then what's left over from there, we get basically an adjusted measure of student learning, which will attribute to the principal in a school in a year. So that's the first model. The second model does that, but just compares the principal to other principals who have served in the same school. So you're only compared to those groups. And then the third one does something very similar, except that for each principal, it estimates a time trend. So whether that learning is increasing over time.